So good morning everybody. I'm extremely happy to be here with Angela Saini. My name is Elisabetta Tola. I'm an Italian science journalist. I'm presenter at the Rai Radio 3 Scienza, which is a radio science program in the Italian National Public Radio. I'm very happy because Angela Saini and I were here 10 years ago presenting her first book, which is Geek Nation. You can see her 4 books here. Angela Saini is a very well-known at this point and very awarded science writer. She is from UK. She's currently based in New York. She has written 4 books. She has also produced podcasts. She's working with many different outlets. But the conversation today will be focusing a lot on her last 3 books, Inferior, Superior, and the Patriarchs. Actually, for the Italian people in the room, the first 3 have been translated into Italian. We are waiting to see if the 4th one, if Patriarchs will also be translated. So I'm very happy because the first conversation was 10 years ago and it was already focusing on the methodology Angela uses a lot for telling her stories. And then these 3 books are now, from my point of view, extremely interesting, interlinked somehow by sort of a connection. So Angela is focusing a lot on the world of science and how science is working and has been working. On one side, trying to uncover and find facts and data that show, for example, that the concept of race is a completely false concept. It's a socially constructed concept. But on the other side, and I start here from Superior, we also see in the journey that Angela is bringing us along in her book, we see that in science there is still, and even nowadays, there are still lines of research and interest in focusing a lot on the differences among human beings. So a sort of a science that's supporting the idea that we are different. Either we're different by race or different by gender or different by intellectual capacity or anything like that. And it's very interesting because it's not a simple journey, Angela. I will start from here. It's actually a very complex one. And you're showing us that we need to embrace that complexity if we really want to somehow contrast the discrimination that are still very existent nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, it's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you for coming when you could be seeing Maria Ressa in another room elsewhere. I'm so grateful that you're here, and I'm so grateful to Elisabetta, who has just been wonderful for a decade. I've known her. It's difficult sometimes doing science journalism because you're trapped between 2 public narratives. One is this idea that our job is to celebrate science and tell people about how wonderful the work that scientists do is, and the new technologies that come out and how brilliant they are. And then on the other hand, science is also a system of power, and it has great control over how we understand ourselves, how we imagine the world, and also how we picture possible futures. So one of the challenges is the position that I take is that I'm there to investigate in the same way that a business journalist investigates business and corporations, a political reporter is interrogating politics. I'm also interrogating science and what scientists do. And what you see repeatedly is that, of course, mistakes are made because these people are only human, like the rest of us. Researchers are only living in the real world. And it's very easy, I think, when you're inside academia or you're inside a private corporation doing scientific work to become so narrowly focused that you lose context. You start to, fail to understand what actually is going on in the rest of the world. And you don't understand the ramifications of what you're doing. Just this morning I was reading in The Guardian that Nick Bostrom, the philosopher who ran the centre at Oxford University looking at long-termism, effective altruism, these very fashionable ideas in Silicon Valley now that all these billionaires have just poured their money into. That centre has now been closed, and part of the reason is because of the huge furore that was created when an email was leaked, a very old message was leaked, in which he wrote about racial differences in intelligence, and he was kind of buying into this idea that different races have different capacities, intellectual capacities. So this idea is real. It lives out there. It is vibrant within certain corners of academia, and it is certainly vibrant on the far right, and you see that being used. I mean, Superior came out in 2019. Since then, we have seen pseudo-scientific racism being published in academic papers, being used by far-right extremists in order to justify horrific attacks, massacres. So in Buffalo in New York a few years ago, the shooter, who was shooting just black Americans in a supermarket in Buffalo, left a manifesto in which he cited academic papers that seemed to support his theory that there were profound intellectual, behavioral differences between races. So this is real stuff. This isn't stuff that just sits on the corners or the fringes of academia and is of no consequence to the rest of us. It matters to how we live.
There is also the issue that sometimes, and I was telling Angela when I was reading the book that I felt sometimes for some of the scientists that she was interviewing, because they struggle to sort of sugarcoat some of their positions, some of their stand on the idea that were behind the research. So, I mean, there are some scientists in the past, we know that for sure, that they have been supporting the idea, for example, of difference in races or difference among populations, so on and so forth. But today, in these days, in the last 20 years, in fact, there are a lot of research. Maybe they're not mainstream research in genetics, for example, or in psychology and neuroscience. Still, they're focusing a lot on the differences instead of than on the actual common trait that human beings have among them. And it's interesting because somehow they are trying to defend that type of research, maybe with the reason that we need to find better therapies, or the reason that we need to find better ways to educate people depending on their capacities. So I was feeling sometimes for the scientists being interviewed by Angela, not because she's absolutely not aggressive, but she was really nailing down this sort of attitude that they might have.
Yeah.
They might be sometimes between naive and not totally honest. Is that right?
Yeah, and sometimes it's hard to tell. So I do think as journalists, it's important for us to understand not just the work that scientists, researchers are doing, but also their motivation. And very often, scientists are keen to conceal that motivation because they want us to believe that what they're doing is motivated purely by curiosity, that they sit outside the real world, that what they're doing is, you know, pure, that it is not tainted by politics or personal prejudice. And of course, that should raise suspicions in us because they are only human, like I said. So getting to the heart of that can be quite difficult. I remember interviewing a very important geneticist at Harvard who had in his... Well, I hope you're okay.
Everyone
I think
okay?
it's fine.
Okay.
I think it's fine. Who had he had just published a book in which he had speculated on the possibility that there could be population level differences that were of consequence to, you know, how cultures have developed and you know, the progress of nations. And this was very controversial, as you can imagine. When I interviewed him, I was genuinely struck by how naive he was about politics. He really didn't understand very much about history or politics or the context in which he was writing, even the history of his own field. You know, we have to remember that genetics emerged out of eugenics. Eugenics research was quite mainstream in early 20th century science. It was just something that was part of everyday research. There were eugenics labs all over the world. Some of them managed to influence public policy, others didn't, but much of the science of human difference came out of that need to understand how to control populations, manage reproduction, make sure that some groups of people were prioritized over others. And to not know that history is quite shocking. You know, it's still I'm still flabbergasted by the fact that we don't teach history to scientists. It's such a crucial part of, drawing the lines, making sure that the same mistakes don't get made. And I'm constantly surprised at how naive very important experts are within their own fields about the history of their own subjects.
It almost looks like reading your books that this kind of naivete extends also to what happens nowadays in terms of the change, the political change, the social change, the cultural change that actually brings people, for example, to be more aware of their rights. So, for example, indigenous communities to be less available to be exploited or more vocal or active in being sure that their rights are not violated, or, for example, to have women to be more active in their different type of movements and not being so happy to be classified as naturally different from men, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes I get the impression that even some of the contemporary scientists, and in your books there are some of this conversation, but I mean, I come from science myself, and I have to say I've been surrounded by this type of people as well, that they seem to be sort of blind also to what the contemporary society is actually somehow moving, and what kind of different claims and more awareness that's become available in contemporary society. It looks as if they don't see that.
No, they don't always see it. I do think there have been turning points, though, at least in the US. I live in the US now, but also in parts of Europe. Academics were affected by the murder of George Floyd in 2020. So that was a very big turning point. And I noticed that in my own work, that the skepticism that I encountered before 2020 almost disappeared after 2020. So politics does have the power to change how scientists think, which is a good reminder of how political science is, of course, because if politics can change how scientists think, then science must be a bit political, at least. So I feel that we can move that conversation, and we already have started to move it a bit, but I am still very wary of the study of human difference in the way that we do it now. We have become more essentialist, if anything. Since Inferior and Superior came out, at that time, the mood was that essentialism was a bad thing, that kind of ascribing certain qualities to groups of people, whether it's women versus men or whether it's different races, was dangerous. And now people wholeheartedly do it because they feel it must be a good thing. The NIH, National Institutes of Health, but also in the EU, there are mandates now that say that if you carry out research, medical research, that you must look at sex and race as a variable. This is for social reasons, because how we live affects our health. And yet, constantly, researchers are treating this as some kind of biological reason, that we are studying these differences because people are different deep down. Nothing could be further from the truth. Of course, there are some hard and fast sex differences, but they are heavily outweighed by individual difference, things that are common to all of us. And on race, these are social differences we're looking at. We're not looking at biological differences at all. And yet, paper after paper keeps getting published, implying that there is something in our genes or something innate to us that makes us fundamentally different. And I think that is driven by this ongoing demand to classify people in research, that we confuse the reasons that we're doing that classification in the first place.
Yeah, there is maybe also the underneath, I don't know, there is maybe even the need to justify what was in the past times was more like the colonial attitude or slavery, for example. Today is not, you cannot say today that you can justify colonialism, but there are other ways.
But people do.
That's people do, but they
Yeah.
actually, it's still an ongoing debate, right?
Yeah.
And it's still an issue that when you actually try to find solution for other people instead of allowing other people to take on their own solution.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very lazy kind of assumption to make that the reason that there is gender inequality or racial inequality in the world is because women are just fundamentally not as good at things as men are, or that different races have innately different capacities, and that's why the world looks the way it does. It ignores all of history. And I think this is something that I wanted to explore in the Patriarchs, is that there was a chapter in Inferior where I looked at male power. Why do men dominate in so many societies around the world? And anthropologists know that this is not universal and it's not timeless. Patriarchy hasn't been around since the beginning. So then the question is, how did we get to this? How did the world become so patriarchal? That is not a biological question. That's a historical question. And it became perfectly clear to me when I was writing the Patriarchs that it has to be a historical question. If it weren't, then it would be universal and timeless. There are at least 160 matrilineal societies in the world which nobody can say are organized, without women having any authority or along patriarchal lines. And history has always gone up and down. Western civilization has seen its peak recently, but before that, there were other civilizations that had their time and were much ascendant. And things will change. Arguably, we're seeing the decline of the West at the moment, the rise of Asia. This is to be expected. This is how history works.
And it's also working not in a linear way, right?
Yeah.
So it's interesting, the Patriarchs, you actually bring us in a different type of journey, but showing that there isn't such a thing as, up to a certain point, they were all matriarchal or matrilinear society, and then somehow patriarchy won. And now we are in this kind of society, which cannot be changed, because at this point, there are a lot also of contemporary sort of surprises that you find in a certain moment, in a certain point. One society is patriarchal and the other one. And the meeting between these two societies is actually quite interesting in that sense.
Yeah, and there are encounters. I mean, we would expect, as humans, if there's one thing that sets us apart from other primates, it isn't the size of our brains, it's the plasticity. So we are capable of literally changing how we think well into adulthood. We can learn new things well into adulthood. And that explains the multiplicity of cultures that we see around the world. The fact that we have all these different languages, all these different ways of living. We should expect huge amounts of social variation globally because our bodies literally allow for that. Our brains allow for that to happen. The further you go back into history, the more social variation you see. The weird thing now is that societies look so homogeneous, that patriarchy is so commonplace, just like democracy is so commonplace, the state has become the model, capitalism, all these things, which are really contingent on, lots of different circumstances, historical circumstances, have become the norm. And the mistake is to assume that they are the norm because they were inevitable, or there is some biological imperative. There isn't. This is just the product, this is just how social change works, history, that empires grow, they impose their ideas on other people. And I don't just mean European empires, I mean the Greeks, Romans, Mongols, so many subsequent empires have imposed these ideas. And oppression is useful to states. If you can divide people up and create classes of people who will work for free, who will be subservient, who will willingly give up their labor for the elites, which frankly we are all a part of, whether you accept it or not. And this isn't just about race or gender, it's also about class. I'm still astounded in the UK at how much deference people still show to the royal family. If you can't believe that we can internalize our own subservience, then you only have to look at the fact that in the UK, there are children so poor right now, poverty levels are so high, that when they go to school, that is the only meal they have that day. That they are, going to school unwashed, with rat bites on their bodies. There have been stories of that. And yet, people turn out in their droves to celebrate the coronation of a new king. A king! He's not there for any other reason except that he was born into this role, and we allow him to have this much wealth. And not just that, we don't just allow it, we celebrate it. That is the internalization of our own class hierarchy. And, we have to understand these mechanisms and how power works psychologically, how it affects us psychologically, but also how easy it is for it to persist over generations because we allow that.
I just have one last question, and then I will open to questions from the audience here, because I'm sure there are many, and we only have 10 minutes left. But the thing is, I go back to this point, Angela, in our conversation, but I think it's very important. You mention more and more this book, for example, The Patriarchs, doesn't want to end in a pessimistic way at all. It wants to end in an optimistic way. We should not give for granted that the power structure we are living in is actually going to be there forever, right? And you say you see a reason for maybe, or you're asking or kind of suggesting to look a lot for the resistance that maybe now are smaller, but they might grow. And that's really what, as journalists as well, we should do more instead of only telling the mainstream story.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's incredibly important to look in the margins, that there are mainstream narratives about, you know, why the world is the way it is, and it's very easy to buy into them and then just repeat them ad nauseum. But if you look in the margins at the differences, that is the most fascinating thing to me. The fact that throughout history we have so much evidence now, and growing, of women warriors, women hunters, and yet we don't, because that doesn't fit into our narrative of how the past necessarily was. We assume the past must have been more patriarchal than the present. That's not necessarily the case. So I'll just give you a very quick example. There was a discovery made, and I think this was about 5 or 6 years ago, in the Peruvian Andes of a hunter. So a hunter who had been buried around 9,000 years ago. And this hunter was categorized as a hunter because they had a hunting toolkit, as it's known by archaeologists, with them. So, you know, blades, knives, you know, everything that you associate with a hunter. And then analysis revealed that this body was of a female. And immediately there were archaeologists who thought, how is this possible? You know, anthropologists said, is this really a hunter? Even some people were claiming that the objects fell into that grave. You know, they couldn't have been there by themselves, or that they were ceremonial, that this person didn't even use them. They couldn't have belonged to the person they were with, even though the evidence is quite clearly, you know, if that body had been male, none of those questions would have been posed. But because it was female, then you had to have all these counter explanations for why this was possible. The archaeologists who made this discovery did an analysis of all the hunter burials in the Americas from that period of time. So this is 9,000 years ago, Neolithic. They found an equal number of male and female burials, so almost the same number. So we can't say that 9,000 years ago in the Neolithic that big game hunting was a gendered activity, because we genuinely don't have the evidence for it. It's possible that one day we will have. Maybe more burials will come up and they will show more of a gender skew. But right now, as journalists, we have to work with the evidence that we have, and the evidence that we have tells us that our narrative about the past needs to be revised. You know, this Flintstones idea that we have of the past needs to be put to one side, because we just don't have the evidence for it. We have to work with what we have. And instead, what I see very often anthropologists and archaeologists doing is start with the narrative and then try to make the evidence fit the narrative, rather than start with the evidence and then create a narrative out of that.
Yeah, that kind of gets into the idea that also the way we tell the past. I'm thinking about museums and collection. Actually, Superior starts in the British Museum. And you say even the way we choose to tell our past, it's a narrative. And it's very interesting, because you say it's not so much that I focus on the object, I actually focus on the museum built to tell a very specific narrative in this case. Yeah,
everyone is always using the past for their particular purposes. This happens all the time. And it happens particularly now. Authoritarian populist leaders and governments manipulate our ideas about the past in order to make us believe in certain ideas about who we are, ideas about identity. And I do think it's important for us as journalists to always push back against that, because the past is constantly being used and abused this way, being manipulated this way. We can build a very feminist narrative about history. It's possible to do that. In fact, that's what I try to do with the Patriarchs. And we don't have to manipulate anything to do that. It's all there. It's right there in the evidence. So don't buy into the stories, I would say, that the populists and the authoritarians, the far right, is trying to sell you.
Okay, questions. Oh, wow. We collect 3 or 4 so then she can give a collective answer. Yeah, here. That's her.
Hi.
Try maybe, I'm sorry, I'm just saying to be a bit synthetic with the question so we manage to answer.
Okay.
Go.
First of all, thank you so much. It was so interesting. I was wondering, because you were talking about like this psychological concept that we have inside our minds, how we deconstruct this concept that like society has built in our minds, and will science be enough to do that?
That's a very good question. I don't think science is enough. We need to understand history. We need to draw in the social sciences and the humanities, because these are complex questions. They're not biological questions purely. They come from all the different disciplines. And for me, I mean, I've undergone this process myself. In the job of writing the books that I have, is fundamentally challenged the way that I think about power. I see the world in a different way now. And that's essentially what this is. It's about dismantling the power structures around you. You see them in a slightly different light. And it's a slow process, there's no doubt. But I do think that interdisciplinary approach is important. And I'm certainly an advocate for that. I've started teaching science writing now. And my lesson to my students is always draw in other disciplines, draw in history, draw in the social sciences, psychology. All of this is important to answering those basic questions.
Thanks. I think maybe there. Okay. Here? Yeah.
Hi. First of all, thank you. I think we all have the same opinion on this. I wanted to ask you how to continue telling stories, those stories of minorities, how to continue representing them in a world where information is really saturated. We feel like we have too much, and all those stories that we didn't know about are coming in. How to keep on representing in this saturated world? Yeah, basically.
I know, it's a huge challenge. And I think that's partly why so I started off in news reporting, and then I moved into writing books. I think partly because I was so frustrated at the limitations of the time pressure that you have when you're a news reporter. You know, you just can't dive into things in the same way. And you find yourself, and I still see this, people find themselves repeating claims that are just untrue. So one that I wrote about a couple of years ago is this assumption that clinical trials don't include women anymore. They do. They have done for 20 years. In the US, it's been mandated for 20 years that women and minorities have to be included at clinical trials at the demographic proportions that they're in. And in the EU, for at least 10 years, it's been the case. So while it was true in the past, it's not true now. And yet, I still see news reporters repeating this claim again and again. So I think it's a challenge, there's no doubt. If it's possible, you know, to find the platform that works for the message that you're trying to get out there and be as concise as possible. So as alongside writing the books, I write book reviews. I find book reviews a really great way of getting across a simple message very quickly. And I occasionally, I'm not on social media much because I get a lot of white supremacists who come after me on social media, but I will occasionally post like a very quick factoid about, you know, a fact about, you know, Taylor Swift has said that patriarchy has been around forever. That's not true. This is why that's not true. You know, things like that, which do grab people's attention, and it reaches different people in different ways. So that Instagram will reach one kind of demographic, the book review in the Lancet or the Telegraph will reach a different demographic, and that way I get a spread. But it's about finding the right outlet for what you're trying to say.
Abbiamo ancora tempo per una? Ok. 5 minuti, ok. More questions. There were other hands up. There. You had, well, here.
Hello. You talked about scientists having motivations that they might not like to be the ones that we hear about. So this is probably a question about your interviewing skills. So like, how do you, when we're talking to scientists, like how do you actually reveal that?
Yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky because they're being deliberate sometimes about their concealment. The first question I always ask a researcher is, what got you interested in this topic? And that can be very, enlightening sometimes, because then they have to go into their past and explain how they got to where they are. So I ask a lot about their personal lives. They're not always willing to talk about them because they like to think about things as separate from from everything else, about their politics, what books they read, what media they consume, just to get a sense of the hinterland, what is lying outside the research that you're actually doing, and spending a lot of time. I spend a lot of time with interviewees, and sometimes repeatedly, and sometimes I stay with them. When I was interviewing Sarah Blaffer-Hurdy, whose motivations are impeccable, I should say, she's a wonderful researcher, but I stayed with her on her walnut farm in Sacramento for a couple of days. I got to know her family, her and her husband, the farm really well. And there have been investigations I've done where I've just stuck to that person like glue for days, just watching what they're doing until they let their guard down. And then in that casual moment, then you get the best stuff.
Thanks, Angela. Thank you all. And